Okay, so I know these different levels in intervals thing is confusing, so let's go over all the intervals and all their different levels. For this, we'll use the example of a minor scale since I'm sure you're sick of seeing major scales by now. First, let's start with the distance of a first. This means the distance from the note you choose to one intervals above it. As you can see, that's just the same note. It's not even a single note above it. So first intervals are always the same. They just have one level. Easy. And since they are technically not even measuring a real distance, we call them unison. Now let's move on to second intervals. Second intervals require you to move one diatonic note up or down. By the way, like I said before, the word diatonic means in the scale, so move one note up in the scale, which means only take into account scale notes. Also, key and scale mean the same thing. Anyway, second intervals. In this case, it's not hard to find places where one diatonic note up or down can be bigger and places where it can be smaller. So second intervals have different levels. 3 to be exact. If the second note is one chromatic note above root, then it's called a minor second. If the second note is two chromatic notes above root, then it's called a major second. And in rare cases, like in the harmonic minor scale, discussed later, if it's three chromatic notes above root, then it's called an augmented second. For this example, I'm using a harmonic minor scale. That's why the space between these notes at the top is so big. Don't worry, we'll cover this scale later. I just wanted you to see an augmented second. Now, before we continue, I need to talk to you a bit about consonant intervals. As you know, in music, we have these two words, consonant and dissonant, to describe whether a sound is pleasant or unpleasant. Of course, in reality, they are much more complex than that, but for now, let's just think of them like this. Consonant intervals are those that sound stable and pleasant to the ear, and dissonant intervals sound tense and unstable. In general, consonant intervals are used more frequently in traditional Western music, while dissonant intervals are used more sparingly and for specific purposes, such as to create tension or movement in a piece. Just so I don't have to explain this all over again, I will include here a list of all possible intervals and whether they are consonant or dissonant. Of course, whether sounds are truly consonant or dissonant depends on culture, context, and so on, but this is largely agreed upon in Western music. For now, most of this info will not make any sense, but I promise if you come back later after finishing this section on intervals, you'll realize how useful this is. Also, commonly, intervals want to resolve melodically either one scale note up or down. For example, major second intervals want to resolve to either unison or major third intervals. I know I just said this like out of nowhere, but it's actually really important that you remember this for melody making. So put a pin on this and come back once we're done talking about top melodies at the end of this book. Of course, this is not obligatory to do, it's just how old classic people did it. But it kind of works, so keep it in mind. Now, you might notice how the augmented and diminished intervals part are the same separations as the major and minor chords. And most of those even change status from consonant to dissonant, even though the half-step separation stays the same. Let me quickly explain. A second interval, for example, means that there are no scale notes between the first and the second notes. This space can be bigger or smaller, but it will be a second interval as long as there are no other scale notes in between. A third interval is a third interval as long as there is only one note between the first and the third notes used to calculate the interval. Now, it can happen that in different weird scales you might have a space of 3 half steps with no scale notes in between your first and your second notes. It can also happen that in some weird scale you might have a space of only 2 half steps between the first and second notes. It can also happen that in that same scale there is a scale note right above our second note. This would make for a minor third interval in this scenario and for an augmented second in this scenario. Both are the same note, but the intervals have different names. Now, why are some major-minor intervals described as consonant, while for that same distance the augmented diminished counterparts are dissonant? I truly don't know. I honestly would just ignore those because chances are you will almost never find those in the wild, except for some augmented intervals. Those are present in harmonic minor scales, but more on those later. Also, to save you some confusion, from this point on I will probably use the terms half step and semitone interchangeably. That's because they essentially mean the same thing. For example, the distance from root to fifth here is 7 half steps or 7 semitones. Moving on. Third intervals can be either major, minor, diminished, or augmented. I know this sucks, but once we get past fourth intervals, I promise it will get a lot easier. So minor third is when there's a 3 semitone space between notes, and major third is when there is a 4 semitone space between notes, provided there is also a scale note in the middle, of course. Remember, it is only a third as long as you can skip a second interval to get to it. If you can't, then that's just a big second interval. You may notice that the diminished third is not here. Well, that's because because for it to appear you would need 3 diatonic notes to be as close as humanly possible, which is something that happens in some scales but not in the ones we'll go over, so forget about those for this class. You may also notice that the augmented third is not here either, same thing, so forget about those too. Anyway, fourth intervals can't be major nor minor. They can be perfect, augmented, or diminished. A perfect fourth is a space of 5 semitones. 1 semitone up, so 6 half steps, and it turns into an augmented fourth. 1 semitone down, so 4 half steps, and it turns into a diminished fourth. Fifth intervals. Here it starts to get more interesting. You see, in music, we don't only count intervals within the notes of one single octave. We count them in all octaves. And like I told you, here you have the option to either go up and count 9th, 10th, 11th, and so on, or go back to 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and so on. Well, if you do the latter, something interesting happens. Moving notes that have an interval relationship to other octaves up or down is called an inversion. More on those later. So basically, if you move the fifth 1 octave down, now it's inverted. And here's where the interesting part comes in. This used to be a perfect fifth, because here it was a space of 7 half steps. When moved an octave down, the space is now only 5 half steps. And remember, in order for you to count up intervals, you have to skip scale notes. The fifth interval is only the fifth as long as it passes over the fourth. Well, here you can see that 1 octave up, it used to pass above the fourth, but now it's an octave lower, and now it only passes the second and third, making it a fourth. A perfect fourth, in fact. But it doesn't stop there. This crazy characteristic also exists in 6th and 7th intervals. So basically, the second interval inverts to the 7th and vice versa, third interval inverts to the 6th and vice versa, and the fourth interval inverts to the 5th interval. And the 1 inverts to the 1, no changes there. So what I'm saying is that the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th intervals are mirror images of the 5th, 6th, and 7th notes. So with that logic, since the 3rd has a major, minor, augmented, and diminished intervals, the 6th must also have them, right? Yes, major 6th or 9 half steps invert to minor thirds, minor 6th or 8 half steps invert to major thirds, diminished 6th or 7 half steps to augmented thirds, and augmented 6th or 10 half steps to diminished thirds. I know this sounds very confusing, so here's a little summary. So by now you must have noticed 2 patterns. The first one is going from diminished to augmented. In the case of major and minor chords, a diminished interval plus 1 semitone is a minor interval. A minor interval plus 1 semitone is a major interval, and a major interval plus 1 semitone is an augmented interval. So diminished is smaller than minor, minor is smaller than major, and major is smaller than augmented. And of course, in the case of perfects, diminished plus 1 equals perfect, perfect plus 1 equals augmented. So diminished is smaller than perfect, and perfect is smaller than augmented. And the second pattern you notice is inversions. Augmented inverts to diminished, major inverts to minor, and perfect inverts to perfect. And of course the other way around. This is a little confusing, so let it sit in your brain for a little bit. And with that, we're done. Those are all the statuses of the types of intervals you need to know. I've made you a simple summary so you never forget them for each scale here. Okay, if you think you got the information so far, you can move on to page 51 on your ebook to complete this chapter's challenge. After that, we're moving on to more about chords.